and funding for the armed forces over the next 3 years. Out of interest, though, when this review was promoted, there were 3 definite parts to it. Firstly was confirming the UK's ambition, and then secondly, confirming the threats that we face and what we want to do about it, and then finally, designing the defence posture in response to that. It seems in this case, though, that you've secured the funding, and congratulations for that, but we're still waiting to hear the first 2 parts. When do you think we're likely to get that full review, full understanding of what Britain's ambitions are in a very changing world?
Well, on the second part, understanding the threat, you don't have to wait for that, both in open source and in my world, in classified information. The threat is enduring, it evolves, and so a large part of the defence contribution to either an integrated review or indeed security is meeting that threat. So I know what I need to do to meet the threat, and once you've met the threat, the second part of the question is, what else do you want to do? And therefore there's your global ambition part. So let's put it that way. First and foremost, the duty is defence as opposed to offence, being able to protect the nation, the homeland, protect our interests and our allies. And I think that's why we can be pretty confident in that the funding we have achieved and the strong requirement we needed for a multi-year settlement will help us meet that threat and modernise to meet the threat. And I don't think that has to wait for the other bit, which is what is Britain's ambition globally. That doesn't mean to say that hasn't been going on in the background anyhow. I mean, all the way through this process, I have been engaged both with the Foreign Secretary and other cabinet ministers, with Professor John Bew, with Number 10, in contributing to the integrated review. And as you know, the original plan had been this to be in sometime in the autumn as the sort of whole package. But I don't think that should have stopped us in defence proceeding to where we are now, which is, the budget is still where it is. The budget is obviously this week, and decisions around funding have to be made, and our capabilities are fundamentally linked to those funding decisions. And I think, therefore, it would have been, quite odd if the other way around happened, if the Chancellor stood up tomorrow and announced X amount of money for defence, and we didn't say anything and said, well, we'll get back to you in the IR to discuss the new money. And I think we just had to make that decision now. I wouldn't have, and I couldn't have, held any longer the challenges around our funding deficit anyhow. These things run out, time runs out, and decisions have to be made. And if you think the SDSR, or the IR, and indeed the CSR is for the following financial year, I have significant pressures in this year alone that I have to meet and deal with. I mean, significant.
Okay. I hear that and understand that, and we're aware of the funding challenges that you face, and it's good to see that you now have the funds to help. But I still go back to the point, I don't want to labour it too much, we still need confirmation of what are officially the threats that we face. And if we're looking over a 5-year or decade period, I would argue, many would argue, that China now poses a geopolitical and strategic threat. Yet nobody in government has yet said that and confirmed it, giving you, the MOD, clarity on where you need to focus. So that's what I'm asking for. When will we get confirmation of that? Is that likely to come in February? You say you know it already, but are we likely to see it in print as to what the threats are, the geopolitical, short, medium, long-term threats that we face to Britain's interests?
Well, there are a range, Tobias, of already documents about the threats we face that come out. But if you want a declaration by the government of who our enemies are, I'm not sure even the IR will be specifically tailor-making a long list of these are the bad guys, these are the good guys, and these are the neutral guys. I think it will be about saying the world is, what is the current status of the world, conflict, instability, what is the current technologies that threaten to defeat our forces or indeed threaten to expose our vulnerabilities. And we've talked about space and counter or anti-space weapons that Russia and China have trialled or tested, indeed even fired, that we should be acutely aware of. I just go back to that point is, I know the sequence is important to you, but between now and January, which I think is when the IR will be delivered as a whole, I think we are talking, 6, 7, 8 weeks, and therefore it was important for Defence, because it's so linked to the budgetary pressures, to get where we were right now. Look, I look at it as a building block rather than a cart before a horse. It's a building block. It's responding to the threats. And a lot of the threats, Tobias, not necessarily need to come with a flag attached. It's about, our forces in some areas are in desperate need of modernisation because of proliferation of capability. So, in the past, it would have been quite easy and comforting to say only the Soviet Union has this capability. So, as you say, we have to declare the Soviet Union as the adversary and in doing so cover everything. Our biggest challenge, I think, in the 21st century is proliferation. So actually, I don't know who all the threats are going to be because their real threat posture to us will be defined by what technology they have got their hands on. So a lot of people out there don't like us.
We need to press on. I'll just make it clear that in the quadrennial review, the equivalent that the US produces, it's very clear in their executive summary exactly what the threats are that they pose. And they name countries that pose a geopolitical threat to the United States interests. I hope that's something that we can tease out of the government to make it clear, because it is that ambiguity, particularly with China, that means we continue in a place of denial. Can we just move on to another area, which there's some outstanding questions? Kevin Jones, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Tobias. Secretary of State, as someone who is passionate about defence, can I welcome last week's announcement of the funding? And particularly as chair of the all-party shipbuilding group, can I also welcome the emphasis on shipbuilding? And clearly the Prime Minister made a lot of play last week about the ways in which this can revitalise our sovereign shipbuilding capacity. So could I just ask, in terms of timescales, something I've asked you on numerous occasions, myself and John Speller, is the issue around the fleet solid support vessels, when these will be procured. And secondly, just in terms of the additional vessels which were announced last week, the new Type 32 vessel, what is this, and will it be able to do our NATO tasks?
Look, on the fleet solid support ship, I think what I've said is, first of all, having effectively cancelled the previous tender process and the previous competition, which was effectively delinquent, we went back out to engage with potential bidders. We've had those discussions, and then we will pretty soon, let me say, be in a position to start the competition. I can get you an exact date if you want one. I can write to the committee and let you know. But as you will understand, getting this right, and part of this, just exactly as you say, part of the challenge for our shipbuilding industry is making sure we have a pipeline rather than a feast and famine. And I want to make sure that all the ship contracts we place allow a throughput of work through our yards enough for me to be able to say to the owners of the yards, you have a reason to invest in your workforce and your capital, because you can't use the excuse that in 5 years' time it's all coming to an end, so why would we really carry on? Because I think you and I both agree that productivity, competition with other sometimes subsidised European yards is really important if we're going to stake a claim for future shipping industry. And that's why I want to make sure that it is scheduled, let's say, to make sure that we absolutely fill a slot when different yards come out of build. And I can't tell you how important that is, because there's nothing more frustrating sitting at my desk and someone says, well, there isn't actually the capacity next year or in 5 years in a yard, so it will have to go abroad or something. And I don't want that to be the reason we can't do it. And so I think that's what I am crafting right now, is making sure it is in the right place.
Would be different yards, would they not? They wouldn't be the sort of destroyer frigate yards, would they?
Well, it does depend on who bids. It does depend on who actually wants to make the ships, because I have come across some. I've been abroad and got business for some certain yards, and I was only told last week that the yard has now decided they don't want to make something. So you need to make progress.
Can you just answer Kevin Jones's question
So
on the
I'll
type
write
32
him
as well?
detail
Write to the
on the
committee
actual,
and then just give us a quick hint as to what the type 32 will be about.
The type 32 is obviously not in the next 5 years, as it won't be straight up, but it's a commitment to put funding to the next type 32 programme. The type 32 we hope will come further along from the type 31. Type 31 is only 5 ships, and the type 32 will hopefully follow a similar track. They will be able to be used for NATO, and we can probably reveal more details about those as we go. The Navy have requested another class of ship, that's the type 32. And if you think of the profile, the type 23, which will be coming out of service, and some of that will be picked up by type 26, and the type 45s, which are obviously, hopefully with a PIP correction, going to run longer than they would have done. I think it's about increasing our surface fighting ships, destroyers and frigates.
It's another letter out of you. If you can just give us the parameters as to what you understand the type 32 to be, so because it's the first we've heard of it.
No,
very exciting.
I will.
We'll do that.
But can I just say something about your point about the IR, and it does link to this. Over the next few months, we will set out some of those issues that you will have concerns about, or specifics. So, I will be doing, as will some of our military leaders, a series of statements or publications to talk about threat, talk about modernisation, talk about the need, if there is, for reform, talk about the new domains, and indeed talk about the Navy's plans. What will be the Navy's plans, for the future?
Right. We need to make progress. We need to get to the heart of why we've invited you here today. And we've got still one more question to cover. Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, the committee is also very much interested in how we reward members of the armed forces, not just reward the armed forces for the response to COVID-19, but also help around recruitment. And I'm wondering if you would agree that that means that members of the armed forces need an above inflation pay rise in the public sector pay negotiations which are going on. Is that something that you would support?
I know, having been through the negotiation process, how very tight we are on the public sector deficit place we're in. I mean, the amount of money we have spent, last week when we announced 16.5 billion more for the armed forces.
I take it that's a no.
Well, no. If we're to give our public sector workers, whether they are uniformed police or, well, I don't know about police, but uniform or military or nurses or anything else, the best we can, we have to get good public finances. And I'd love to reward our armed forces. We are rewarding them through this settlement of things like free wraparound childcare, to make them, to add to their terms and conditions and giving them a better support. But I'm also recognise that we have to balance, do our best to try and deal with this economic impact. And so, look, all public sector workers, where it's up to the Chancellor in the end how he manages the overall nation's finances. But at the moment, in this period, I would say that I support the position of the Chancellor, and we'll get more details next week.
Thank you.
Tomorrow.
Okay, can I just endorse the spirit of what Martin Doherty-Hughes is saying? People never join the armed forces for the money, but it shouldn't be a reason because the money becomes so low that they are prevented or deterred from serving their country. Moving to the pandemic now. Richard.
Yes, and Secretary of State General, welcome. Just quickly before we do that, Secretary of State, you and I are both ex-soldiers. We like common sense, at least I hope we do. News from Catterick left me a little bit aghast. And just quickly, can I ask you this? The left form has been banned. The throwing of the grenade has been banned. The rifles are sanitised when they are withdrawn. And soldiers queuing for food keep 2 metres apart and wear masks, and then go straight back to the rooms and mix. This is causing quite a few problems for the training up there. I don't really see this as common sense, and I thought we were talking about the armed services, not the social services. Can you comment on this?
Well, I can investigate because I'm going to Catterick on Thursday. So I shall, and I'm going to the Infantry Training Centre. I'm not sure why you can't throw a grenade any day of the week.
Because you're 2 metres away apparently from your safety instructor, or within 2 metres, so it's been banned.
Right, okay. I shall...
I look forward to hearing your response to that. On to the first question. So what has the government learned about the effectiveness of its existing crisis management structures for managing this sort of national emergency, Secretary of State?
I think what we have learned is, first of all, the importance of resilience. Now, for defence, resilience is sort of our middle name. It's part of what we do. I think the government as a whole has understood now more than ever that they must invest in resilience in their own functions. The warning signs have been there for quite a few years. WannaCry in the cyber attack on WannaCry, which predominantly ended up in the NHS sort of outpatient system. And I remember when I was sort of security minister at the time, the impact of that. And I was interested to look at lots of departments at that stage who really didn't even know their IT footprint. And, you know, resilience is part of preparation, but it's also about learning to move at pace and then think about the over horizon as you go. So, you know, my department very, very quickly in this response effectively shifted from the leaders involved shifted from that to handing that to their deputies to focus on what next. So I think that's the first thing that government has practiced and had to learn is the real key importance of resilience. I think the MOD has done very well with its own resilience, both in testing and supporting its workforce, but also in making sure that we can move at pace. We're already thinking, we were thinking about winter preparations months ago in the MOD. We are thinking about Brexit months ago in the MOD. We are thinking about the vaccines before we even knew if the vaccines would be on stream in December. And that is, I think, the first thing. I think the second thing was the National Resilience Capability Plans that are owned by the Cabinet Office. How current to the threat are they, and how realistic they are. And I think what will be interesting is when all this is over in COVID and there is an inquiry and people look into it, I think the question will be, what was missing from those plans. So to give an example, when I was Security Minister, I signed off the national, bioscience or safety strategy, where I did say that pandemics were sort of the number one threats, but at the time, no one really thought about test and trace. No one really thought about social distancing. They thought about pandemics being probably much more higher up the lethality scale. And so, we didn't really have that test and trace concept in the way that we learnt on the job. So I think that's the second thing. I think we've also learned that, as ever, defence is there to underpin the fabric of the society we live in and defend it. And it has, I never fail to be impressed by the versatility of our soldiers, no matter what they're doing. They are...
On that point, Secretary of State, you listed a whole lot of things that you've learnt or hopefully will just slip into the operation, God forbid it's needed again. But have you been sufficiently involved at the top level? This has been in the press and commented on many times that the armed forces are not sufficiently at the top of this crisis to guide, dare I say, some of our politicians, perhaps, in managing it.
So I think in February or March was the first time we had the senior officers across government departments from literally back in February, March, doing C2, command and control, helping them plan, and also very quickly right down to a more regional or devolved level. So we had people in London Ambulance Service really quite early on. We had people down through what you and I would call regional brigades, but now they're called JMCs, I think. The MOD just changes the name every now and then to confuse us all. But if you and I talk about regional brigades, we know what we're talking about. So we had quite quickly individuals. The policy decisions that fall out of their advice is obviously a matter either for their Secretary of State or indeed for the central, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Office. But I don't think it was for want of our advice, but I think it was, the challenges, was the advice needed, acted on? We have always made ourselves available. You know, I know colleagues often say the army could do more, we could do more. We could always do more, but in this country we don't come along and impose. You know, we wait for the request, for example, from the Scottish Government. If the Scottish Government wants more assistance, we have a MACA process, and we are absolutely happy to help the Scottish Government or the Welsh Government or indeed the local authorities. And that's why when I last came to committee, I made it clear I have devolved my authorities down to the regions, down to as low as possible, to allow uninterrupted assistance where it's requested.
You were available, but would you like to have done more? I think that's the point.
I think we have done. So a lot of the stuff we have done is not been as visual as standing on the streets doing testing. So I can give you an example. Very early on, we had a request, I think it was from DHSC, to go and pick up a whole load of PPE from Liverpool Port. Huge. And I think it was DHSC who originally thought that was 9,000 people they wanted. By the time we had worked with them, worked it through, I think it turned out to be about 200 people. So that wouldn't have been publicised. That's just in the background, helping the command and control efforts. We stood up lots of people at Donington to receive all the ventilators, mainly came from China, to unpack them and distribute them. We had people from the intelligence corps helping scrub and analyse data in London of hospital pressures. And so I think we have done an awful lot. I have never said no unless it's completely unreasonable or sort of left field and didn't add a value or actually have an effect. And I'm not even sure we've actually said no to anything. I think what we've done is refined, and it's turned out that it wasn't what it needed.
Thank you very much. John. Thank you.
There's a gap here, isn't there? Because you said, for example, policy for their secretaries of state. Now, surely the only way you can effectively manage crisis and over successive crises is through the COBRA process, is through that coordination and integration and often almost daily examination of what did we decide yesterday, how's it been implemented today, what are we doing tomorrow, where departments then are pulled together, and by the way, including the other nations' governments as well. They're an integral part of it, but that's what drives the process. And I'm slightly concerned. It's not just about the availability of bodies. It's very much about the involvement of the military mindset into the day-to-day gritty decision-making and implementation. And it doesn't. See, how often has COBRA been meeting, and at what level has the Ministry of Defence been involved?
Well, the government set up something called COVID-O, which is ministers attending, which meets, I can't tell you, 2-3 times a week sometimes, which is effectively a COBRA. I have sat on it a number of times, and if I'm not on it, the Minister of the Armed Forces attends, depending on what the subject is. And that is a key decision-making body. It meets quite regularly. I think the last one was on Saturday, and then previous that Friday before, and it meets very regularly. Michael Gove chairs that.
When you say Saturday, do you mean, and you say Friday before, do you mean 2 days sequentially or a week between?
I'm trying to be honest, I'm trying to work out. I think I met on Saturday, and that was discussing the impacts of mass testing and how to increase mass testing, learn the lessons from Liverpool, etc. And a number of cabinet ministers were on that call. And then the Friday one, I am trying to remember what it was. I think it could well have been COVID relating to impact on, or maybe it was even COVID and the end of year winter pressures. It was the whole resourcing area around that. So I think that was the week before, but it does meet fairly regularly. It usually meets at least once a week, maybe twice a week. And so that has been just like a COBRA. I mean, having done 20 odd, 30 COBRAs in my previous time, I can tell you this is very, very similar to a COBRA. It's just specifically dedicated to COVID.
We need to prepare. Is that okay, John? I think Sarah, Emma wants to come in here as well.
Thanks, Chair. Afternoon, Secretary of State. Just wanted to drill down a bit more on the answers you've given to my colleagues there. Obviously, at the outset of the pandemic, there were regular COBRA meetings, then they went to ministerial implementation groups, then they went to COVID response meetings at cabinet level. I'm just wondering how many of those in total, out of that total, you yourself attended or any of your ministers attended?
Well, I think my ministers will have attended nearly every single one, me or one of my ministers. I can get the exact numbers that I attended and the exact numbers that the Minister of the Armed Forces attended or otherwise, potentially dependent on what the subject was. It usually depends on the agenda item and how key impacts onto the military, either resource or indeed where we can assist, if you know what I mean. So, but I can get the exact details, but there's nearly always a member of the Armed Forces, Ministry of Defence ministerial team in attendance to those meetings.
Thanks for that. And just one final quick one from me on this topic again. Secretary of State, has the Ministerial National Security Council actually met to discuss the pandemic? And if so, were you present or any of your ministers at that?
Well, the NSC has met on a range of topics, literally every week or every other week, depending. I have attended...
But the ministerial...
What?
Secretary of State, has the Ministerial National Security Council met?
The National Security Council is always ministerial, unless it's an NSCO. So the NSC, the members include myself, the Home Secretary, Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, the heads of the intelligence services, Chief Defence Staff, and a range of other cabinet ministers dependent on the subject. So that I mean, it hasn't met every single week, but it has met on a number of occasions to deal with a range of topics, not just COVID, but you know.
Okay, if you could get me just in the figures that you're going to provide for the other meetings, if you could get me those in relation to the pandemic as well, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Sometimes it's the consequences of the pandemic rather than the pandemic itself we may discuss.
Secretary of State, how have things changed since the departure of Dominic Cummings?
What do you mean? I mean, Dominic Cummings is an aide to the Prime Minister.
Just asking you, have things changed?
In the MOD, nothing has changed. That we are, we have led the department. I've led the department. Chief of Defence Staff is responsible for the military staff, the Permanent Secretary, and nothing's changed in that far. We have, the MOD was the author of our part of the integrated review work, author of our budget. But what I will say is Dominic Cummings was actually a big supporter of this defence settlement, and that shouldn't be underestimated. A number of people recognise that in the world going forward, this is a anxious time in the future of stability for the globe, and he was a supporter alongside many others in Number 10 about giving defence a settlement.
That should be recognised, and he should be thanked for that. Stuart.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, the military has a can-do attitude and will always turn their hand to things. And I look through some of the MACA tasks we've been doing from helping, or the military have been doing from helping with flooding to incidents that happen where they support the police, like Manchester bombing. So you've mentioned the resilience and the great job that they do, but do you think other government departments and agencies have used the best use of resources of the military and their capability during the pandemic? We know that you would always, yes, we'll go and do it, but have other government agencies and departments done that?
I think what I might do is ask General Strickland to ask, because General Strickland is part of the process of sifting, of taking a request or an aspiration and converting it into an effect, and we're in it to deliver an effect. What effect can we have on X, A, B, C? And I think General Strickland has a hands-on experience of dealing with all those ranges.
Very happily. I think the really interesting thing is, as the Secretary of State says, it's a conversation between ourselves and another government department. So one, I would say, another lesson we've learned is the MACA process works extremely well, in that we've actually said, if you can provide this by another means, why are you coming to the military is a good question to start with. And then there's a conversation about what are you trying to achieve. So a really good example, again, was we did we had 150 people from the RAF in Birmingham recently doing drop and collect to start the whole testing process work through. And it seemed very sensible at the time, and it was also involved with the local authority and volunteers and other players in the game. But when we looked at it and we refined it, then we went to Nottingham, we sent 6 people. as a team to actually train and then motivate and mobilise a team of volunteers. So I think that just gives you a sense of actually the way we refine these things as we go forward. The Secretary of State mentioned the whole issue of Donington and PPE in the past. One of the things that we did with the DENS, our organisation that does supply and does purchase, we actually put over 130 people into the supply chain of the NHS when we were having real troubles with PPE to use their correct expertise. So it wasn't just military manpower, but we understood the issue was rapid purchase and rapid distribution, which was something that the NHS supply system wasn't used to doing. So I think as we've gone along this journey, the most important thing is it is a conversation between ourselves and the other government department. And we refine it to the point where actually military expertise or defence expertise can best play.
Thank you, Sue. So through this process, you'll be working with a lot of different agencies that you won't have built relationships over the time. And you're finding out, like a prime example, 9,000 troops are needed, and actually you're 200. They're probably riflemen if they only need 200. But moving on to look at that, what have you learned about cooperation with other agencies and departments now?
So before the pandemic happened, we always had a number of cross-government liaison officers, particularly linked with the CCS, the Civil Contingency Service, linking into my team in the Defence Crisis Management System in the MOD. But what we found very early on was actually understanding the needs of other departments. We developed a thing which we've called the neural network. So we started to put individuals, talented individuals in most of the government departments in the right place of the heart of where they were examining the crisis. And a really good example is recently, now when we understood that BAYs were going to be buying the vaccines, not distributing them, but actually buying them and trying to understand how vaccine rollout may occur, we put a bright, sparky Lieutenant Colonel in there and said, go and make yourself known, find out what's going on and find out what the exam questions might be. And so this neural network spreads across most government departments and then links either into the Ministry of Defence or to the Standing Joint Headquarters in Aldershot, where the operational level games play out. But that ability to have a synapse and understanding early has also allowed us to be much more sophisticated about how we've dealt the MACA process.
Those bright individuals that you put in, were they well received? Did they have to? Was it challenging for them to help educate on the process of how the military operates?
We also, two things I think, is interestingly, I think in a time of crisis everybody pulls together. But we took the approach departmentally of a sort of buzzword bingo of understand, enable, support and catalyse. So we never put somebody, you're not there to go and be in charge, lady or gentleman, you're there actually to understand and help. And so that sort of humility that I think the Defence is very good at playing through, I think was a really good start point. The other thing we've done with other government departments is the Standing Joint Headquarters has actually done MACA training courses. So we've found people in government departments who might be putting these requests in, and we've taken them through a day of this is how you ask for it, this is what you should ask for, and this is how you do it. So there's been an assist of educating our partners in government to actually make it a more fluid and efficient process.
Thank you very much, General. Chair?
Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. In Wales, we've seen military deployment on quite a few MACA requests, mobile testing, decontamination of the Welsh ambulance, planners embedded in NHS Wales, and recently mass testing in Merthyr Tydfil. And it's been greatly appreciated on the ground. People have been reassured by the presence of the military. But on the premise of it's better to make friends before you need them, what lessons have you learnt from your working with the devolved administrations?
Well, I mean, from a sort of policy or political point of view, I think we shouldn't forget we already had in the military existing networks. We had these regional commands or JMCs. We had local resilience officers in every region, and it was one of the very first things we did was thicken up the numbers of those people. So they sort of used to, forgive me, man-mark, you know, a number of local authorities, and we made sure that there was literally one per person. And secondly, I think, you know, we've always made an effort, either directly with Scottish and Welsh Government and Northern Ireland Assembly to have direct relationships, as well as via our, you know, territorial officers. So I don't think we had a problem with, you know, it wasn't like we had to learn something new with the Welsh Government. They've always been very forward-leaning and were very clear when they wanted our help. And the same goes for the Scottish government. I don't think there was has been a problem in that space. I can ask about Charlie. General Stickland can tell you about his actual experiences of requests, but again, it's been pretty straightforward.
I think it's been fine, and I think the point the Secretary of State makes is actually the job of that regional commander or joint military commander, that we have 10 across the nation, of varying different scales, but actually we have a structure, both their job is to actually run a network. And actually know local characters and know local players. Similarly, most of the services have reserve senior officers who, again, are their regional representative. And as the Secretary of State said, that was a really, really important thing early on to manage to galvanise and thicken that network. And again, it was all about understanding. Then we understood, okay, you need some planners because you've got a particular problem with this particular issue of distribution or linking to a health authority. But really the key thing we learnt was actually the structures we have and the relationships we have are an excellent foundation for a subsequent crisis response.
General, if you flip it the other way, what has, for example, the local resilience forums learnt from the military? I mean, you've mentioned planning, analysis, logistics. We've got innovation with the Nightingale hospitals. So what have these organisations learnt from you, and how do you galvanise that as you go forward?
I think we came across, as we went through, very different levels of capability and competence in local resilience forums. Some had never sat, and some were just essentially a paper tiger. Others had a dynamic individual in charge of them, from all walks of life, and they were an entity, and therefore they thought through their programs. And so I think the key thing we can teach them is, one, they need to sit and they need to think about the consequences of their responsibilities, but also the issue of anticipation. But more than anything else, they form a synapse for all manner of different parts of local government, of which, with the health service as well, they're trying to essentially link together a very complex system at the local level. Their very existence can act as that synapse. And so I think actually regular rehearsal, regular anticipation, and being a formed body is where I would say, from a military perspective, the Secretary of State would have a view from his own constituency views as well.
I mean, we went around quite a few of the LRFs. I think remember, LRFs are a reflection of their area's local authority governance structures. So if you have a pretty straightforward area, a unitary and coterminous districts, you tended to find they were more straightforward. If you had LRF areas where you might have a very powerful, big authority, let's say Birmingham City, but that sat alongside all the sort of licorice all sorts type of local authorities that we all experience as local MPs, then sometimes they were not as straightforward or as used to suddenly stepping up and being maybe the driver of that. And I think that's what I would say. You could have a completely different experience in one part of the country from another. And I think one of the lessons from this is that, exactly as General Stickland said, this sense of, you've got to be more than a paper tiger. You've got to actually practice, sort out in peacetime, effectively, the lines of responsibility, the leadership, the relationships between the district councils. I mean, it's as subtle as, if your district council leaders all get on, then you are going to be far better as an LRF than if they're always arguing with each other. And that's just local politics. Sometimes it's not often party politics. It's local politics.
Okay, is that okay, Sarah?
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Chair.
I want to stick with the devolved administrations, but Nightingales were mentioned. Can we just follow that up? With great fanfare, these were rolled out in different parts of the country, most noticeably in the XL Centre. But in the briefing that I received this morning for the Southwest, I asked where there is pressure and likelihood that we could go into a higher tier because of the pressures on bed spaces. I then asked, why are we not utilising the Nightingale hospitals? I was then told that they're not being used. We haven't got the staff, and where they are working, people don't like to use them because they're dark and dingy, was the terms that were used. So a lot of money was spent and a lot of political capital utilised. These were rolled out in front of the television cameras. How successful have they been? Are we utilising them to their full capability, bearing in mind this pandemic is far from over?
Well, I think, Tobias, we have to remind ourselves that when this started, all the advice and the warning signals was this would have a huge number of people requiring ventilation. That was the initial medical treatment, was a view that this disease caused quick dependency and high levels of ventilation. And so the design of the Nightingales was predominantly to be mass ventilation units. They didn't have showers built, they didn't have canteens, because people would arrive effectively under a ventilation, be ventilated, and hopefully come back out. So if you visit them, the configuration is not to be an alternative hospital or a primary care centre, it is to be predominantly that. Now, over time, if you remember, every nation in Europe went and bought lots of ventilators, and we had the ventilator challenge and did X, Y, and Z. And over time, we realised that, and I'm sure a clinician will give you a much more professional answer, but the treatment is different. And therefore, we have Nightingales, not all of them, that were more configured for what we thought was going to happen. Now, your question is valid about, well, now that's clearly not the case. What are we doing to change them? Well, in some areas, like Harrogate, we have used them to do other functions. We have used them in some areas to, I think, do scans or something. We can get the details. But in some areas, they have. In other areas, there hasn't been the demand from the local healthcare services to either change their configuration or indeed use them as they are. Now, if they do wish to do that, then again, we, like last time, will help design them, set them up, deliver them.
Okay, so this goes to the point that Richard Drax was made, that what the MOD is providing to support this pandemic. And this is a great example. Bournemouth and Poole, where our R rating has gone up, not because you're catching the pandemic from outside, but ironically because people who are going in with non-COVID related diseases were picking up the pandemic inside the hospital. And the consequence of us going into another tier is because of our high rating caused by the spread inside hospitals. You alleviate the pressure off those hospitals by using Nightingales as a strategic planning to take us through another 6 months at least of this pandemic. And so I ask why top-level decision-making isn't recognising that you can alleviate pressure on hospitals across the country if we better utilise those Nightingales in the way that you now describe.
Well, so Tobias, there are two questions, but they're not for me. Number one, ask your local hospital trust, has it demanded more bed space?
No, and okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but this is the trouble that we face here, is that there remains a stigma of failure if you lean to use the military. And that is something that I've picked up and has been picked up, including the strategic decision making at the top, when you have policy makers making operational delivery decisions. MPs, our colleagues, cabinet members, no experience in emergency strategic thinking or enduring crises, making judgments which the military, the MOD, you guys are trained to do. But unfortunately, there is a sense of failure if you resort to using the military too much. Now, it's got better, absolutely, I'd agree with that. But I do say that this is the decision making that we need to see in number 10. If there is pressure on our NHS, you guys can provide Nightingales. Surely it then makes sense to utilise that.
Well, look,
I can do a couple of stats if you like.
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, Tobias, I regularly text or ring or speak to the health secretary or colleagues or at cabinet and say, we're here. To be fair, 27% of our current MACAs are DHSC, right? I don't think the DHSC has a stigma problem with the MOD, and I don't think across a number of our departments, my department of colleagues, who always will often praises the military at cabinet, there is a stigma attached. But I think part of this is a fundamental question about, do you think demand for military support should be ground up, or should it be imposed from the top? And I don't mean imposed by other government departments, but by me. I mean, should I be able to say, right, I'm going to change the Nightingale Hospital in Bournemouth because their bed spaces are tight or not? Now, as much as I see pressures on my statistics every morning, in this country, the military acts in support of civilian authorities. And I'm sure we all have cases where we think, I could just fix that with 100 men and women, right? But fundamentally, it has to be a driven thing. And so my question to you is, get Bournemouth NHS Trust in here, get other people in here and ask them, how are you meeting that demand? And if NHS Trust and Bournemouth are saying we don't want the army or we don't want more beds, then that is a discussion that they have to have with you.
Well, we'll take that away. I now want to look at other parts of the United Kingdom. Let's first turn...
Surely that is where the COBRA process comes in, because in real time or within a day, that can be brought there with everybody, all the interests represented in the room, decisions made, the Cabinet Office stroke Prime Minister's office therefore being in touch with it, and they drive that through. Isn't that how you resolve the disconnect, which clearly you have between, very often, between different departments?
Well, they do drive it through, John. They do drive it through. But if they don't agree with the analysis, let's say, Tobias has made about his health trust, if they take a view that either the hospitals have said to them, we're fine with bed capacity, or that they've taken a view that bed capacity can be dealt with in another way, then it doesn't need to be driven through because they've made that decision. Now, you can hold them all to the account for their decisions they have made, but what is absolutely not true is that there is any resistance in those meetings to calling on defence assets. If they've asked, we have shaped. If they've asked, we have delivered. If they've asked, we have helped design in many cases. We helped design the Nightingales.
I think we need to press on. The point has been made very, very clear. This is a pandemic that's hitting the country. It's affecting our NHS system. You create Nightingales and remove the COVID patients and put them in Nightingales. You then liberate our standard NHS from the pressures it faces. It's as simple as that. That's a decision that could have been made at the top, and it wasn't. And that's what we pose. And it is something that the MOD could have provided. Let's now turn to Scotland. Martin, I know you've been waiting patiently. Over to you, sir. And then to Northern Ireland with Gavin.
Thank you, Chair. I've got to admit, though, I'm a bit surprised by the conversation which has just taken place. And I'm not going to speak on behalf of my good friend, the member for Belfast East, but I know that the good work that the military have done in the construction of the Louisa Jordan doesn't seem to be mirroring that discussion, because I know that there's been over 4,000 patients through the doors since July, diagnostics, CT scans, ultrasounds, orthopedics, and also it's been utilised by, I believe, nearly over 1,000 medical students. So I do hope there's some, you get round that with the Nightingales. Secretary of State, if I could come to you in terms of the devolution element across the UK, there are many of us are quite grateful that for what we're seeing is, for example, a historic moment in which from your, I always say, leadership has seen a one-star general put in positions to discuss and inform and to assist the devolved administrations in dealing with the pandemic. And we, for example, see that with the design of the Louisa Jordan and also elements of testing. I'm just wondering, would you think it's important now that that historic engagement is retained in dealing with what remains of the pandemic period, but once we leave the pandemic, to ensure that the MOD is interlinked, for example, with the Resilience Division, which leads on emergency planning response, for example, in Scotland, and also its Northern Irish and Welsh counterparts?
Well, I do agree, but to some extent, that is part of their standing function. When even before this, that the 1-star or 2-star, depending on which part of the United Kingdom they're in, their role is to be absolutely across, or should be across, all of that, both critical national infrastructure challenges, both community outreach and support, veterans even, but also alongside the devolved administrations. I mean, that is what they should be doing, and if they're not or haven't done it, then they're not fulfilling their task. I mean, some of the ones I've known in the past have been all over those relationships, and a lot of it comes down to individual relationships. I mean, we all know that individual relationships can really turn things, turbo boost them, but definitely the lessons they've learned over the last, few months, I hope we absolutely incorporate them and make sure that it's even stronger in Scotland or Wales and Northern Ireland. And I think in some areas it's been really, really good, irrespective of your position on nationalism, unionism, irrespective of that, at showing that the military is a force for good You know, it does do resilience, it does planning, it does help, it does assistance, it does humanitarian. It's all of those things, as well as being obviously a warfighting force in the case of extreme issues. And I think that's been hopefully really supported. And I know, you know, that there has been no shortage of praise from my own personnel for their relationships with the Scottish Government, and enjoyed working with them as well.
I suppose, Chair, my final bit is that there is some concern that once the COVID pandemic is over, that will be withdrawn. And the reflection is that because of the Secretary of State's own understanding of devolution, being a member of the Holyrood Parliament from 1999 to 2003, is that they themselves have informed that change of attitude. I just hope that that is retained after the pandemic, because it has been a positive step forward.
Well, look, I'm very happy to capture it. It is a permanent post, the 1-star in that place. And I think we should just capitalise on it. I mean, you know, I was fortunate enough to represent North East Scotland, so I know how important the Highland Islands are to how people live their life and how they live it much more primary care based than often acute care. And that's why very early on we sent not a squadron, a Puma detachment, I was about to say troop of Pumas, right up to Kitnos or Lossiemouth to be able to service those islands should they need it. And I think that was important. But look, I'm very happy, and way after all this finishes, if there are problems, you should come and let me know, because the whole purpose of some of these posts are exactly as you said and as Sarah said earlier, to make sure that the ground is smooth between the two, and we are there to help.
Martin, is that okay?
Yep, that's great. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Martin. Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, Secretary of State. You'll know from your time as a Minister within the Northern Ireland office that the interaction with Ministry of Defence isn't the same across various elements of our community, but I'm sure you were pleased at the start of this pandemic that political maturity meant that MACA requests were made to Ministry of Defence and the majority have been satisfied. But when you look at the way in which various devolved administrations and regions of England have engaged with the Ministry of Defence, do you recognise that there is more that could be asked of Ministry of Defence, and that Ministry of Defence have a positive role to play in rolling out mass testing, as but one example?
I certainly think that one of the lessons from this event is that we need to help other people understand us. You know, I think, let's put it that way, that as General Stickland said, the more they understood the MACA process, the more they understood what we could do for them, the better the requests were, the more refined they became, and the more impacting we could deliver, more impacts we could deliver. And I think that's what I would say over time, is that, you know, there were some departments we dealt with at the beginning of this who had never seen a MACA request. But if you are DEFRA, for example, in England, or you are the Home Office in England, you have been used to using MACAs forever, because you are in a security area or flood area or whatever. But there are other departments who just were not used to using MACAs. And I think at the end of this, the key is going to be capturing that corporate knowledge so that we never let go of it again. And building on the relationships, as Martin talks about, so we don't have to relearn that if something goes wrong.
I'd also cover it if there's a new issue which none of us really understand. So, for example, we just deployed 2 people to the GMC in Northern Ireland to talk about vaccines. And that's really just to try and understand what the mechanisms might be in Northern Ireland, how this architecture may play in the various cohorts that are now being discussed by the national rollout from BAYS. And just by having 2 people actually seeking to understand and talk about it, again, as the Secretary of State says, you can refine that and understand whether, and the answer may be we can't help at all. It may not be our business. But actually we can connect through our network into those that can. So I think there's some interesting things about rapid liaison to discuss future concerns or future ideas and then refine them as we discussed.
Gavin, is that okay?
Just to confirm, Chair, that's the 2 people have arrived in Northern Ireland, is that right? Attached to 38 Brigade now to discuss whether there is a beneficial relationship in the rollout of vaccine. Is that what I understood the General to say?
We essentially sent 10 teams out to various parts of the country to have that conversation. So yes, that will be worked through 38 Brigade.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Gavin. Sarah, on to top table exercises.
Secretary of State, under the MACA principles, the MOD play a supporting role in the challenges of the pandemic. So my question was going to be to you, do you feel that you've held a senior ministerial position in the various cabinet discussions, COBRA, COBRA-O and the ministerial implementation groups? I think we've probably covered that, but please feel free to add any more. So my next question really is, I've been informed that you facilitated a Whitehall tabletop meeting in summer. So what conclusions were drawn from that?
I'll let Phil
So it was called Project Fairlight, and we worked very, very closely with the COVID task force in the Cabinet Office and with the CCS. And essentially we were exactly that, facilitating the questions and the structure. We managed to put, I think it was all 31 SROs together, and for them the whole idea... I'm sorry.
Could you very kindly explain the acronyms, because not all of us, people watching, don't understand what you're talking about.
Fascinating. So for me, that wasn't even a military acronym. It's a cross-government acronym, which is Senior Responsible Officials. Thank you. So forgive me, and please shoot me down whenever I speak in code. And the idea was, first of all, to get those group of responsible officers from government departments at the essentially 3-star level to expose their plans. And it went through a number of scenarios over the course of 36 hours to actually to draw together where do they link together. And the crucial two things we determined, and we gave a report into the Cabinet Office, were very simple. Was one, an issue of concurrency, and that to a certain degree in the summertime, there was still not enough sufficient thought in things happening in a concurrent sense. It was all about the winter problem set. So it wasn't just about COVID, but it reflected also things that may occur under the EU transition. So concurrency was a key one. And then the second one I would pull out, which I think was very clear, was actually the idea of making sure everybody understood that there was direct interplay and connectivity between individuals' plans. There were dependencies that certain senior responsible officials hadn't realised between their plans. And I think those were the two biggest things we drew out. And then after that was a subsequent thing. So, okay, people need to now link up and understand how those dependencies work, how we issue concurrency. And we built on our concurrency tabletop exercise that the Secretary of State had mentioned earlier on.
Can I ask about the concurrency side of things? Did you have to change anything following the tabletop exercise? And I'm thinking about numbers of personnel that you deployed or put on standby, thinking about winter pressures.
So I think there's two parts to that question. The first one is from a government perspective. Our findings went to the Cabinet Office and have been taken forward. So, for example, tomorrow I'm going with the Minister of the Armed Forces to a maritime security tabletop exercise, which has drawn on Fairlight, and I can come back to that if you wish. From an MOD perspective, we had in September already gone through our work to look at what we termed the winter concurrency set. And we looked at a worst-case scenario that involved things, floods, fires. I don't think we covered locusts. We looked at COVID activity, and we looked at those things that we are being essentially asked potentially to support for EU exit. And then we layered on top of that a counter-terrorist issue and what we call op tempora. And so what we tried to do was essentially create the most difficult day. And what we did was we system checked, do we have actually the appropriate forces at readiness throughout this period. And what we built was what we call the winter concurrency package. And we also built a winter ops centre augmented by some people such that we are stood up through this period. So from an MOD perspective, we then presented that to Secretary of State, said this is what we think we need. If we need to surge and add to it, that's a different conversation. But as a baseline winter preparedness force, we think we've got it covered off in all of these various areas and accepting where we might be duplicating or double hatting. And from a government perspective, I think tomorrow's a really good example. The scenario is some fisheries business with some Russians deploying through the Mediterranean through the channel, and then a safety at sea incident, trying to look at how do we do national command and control down to the gold level, and how do we manage that concurrency challenge. So I think hopefully Fairlight has triggered and stimulated those sorts of conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, General, because I was just going to ask there, did you factor in a watching brief on potential adversaries? But you did with the Russians, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Stuart Anderson.
Thank you. Secretary of State, are we going to see a formal review of lessons learned from this pandemic? And there's an area I'd be specifically interested in, is in that review, if it was forthcoming, is to see if we've effectively used veterans to support in this area, and if not, why not, and could we adjust that moving forward?
So certainly the department will do a sort of lessons summit, and I think it's just we are doing already, like General Strickland talked about Fairlight and all that sort of thing. We're already learning as we go in some of them, but I think yes, when touch wood, this all comes moves to the side, I think we will do a lessons summit, and we will definitely draw together every single thing we can. And to be fair, Defence is used to those things, whether it's post-Falklands or post-Gulf or whatever. And I think that's very important. I know the government has said that they will support an inquiry into it, and I hope from that inquiry, I think, comes out lessons across government. On your issue of could the veterans do more, I think what I would say is, again, I remember at the beginning, we had both the DCMS made a massive call for volunteers. We had the former, veterans charity, I was talking about it at the Rubicon, come forward. And what I would say is, what's the pattern of assistance from the military has seemed to follow a similar trait, which is a request, and then the first real support is really in the areas of logistics and planners, and that then transitions to mass for a period of time, and then the mass falls away, and then we go back to another request. So Liverpool would be a really good example. It starts off with a request for a few planners and an understanding of how could we do something. We then deploy mass, over 2,500 men and women, mainly of the army, to assist in Liverpool. But then if you look now at the take-up of the testing and the lessons learned as we're doing the testing, I think we're roughly doing about 12,000 tests a day or something at the moment, but we have a capacity of 40,000. So then we start asking the question of, well, do we need all these soldiers standing around if we're not coming up to that, and other people need that mass elsewhere? And what we'll see is the lessons will be, how can we be more intelligent in finding people to test? So let's move out from fixed bases, let's be more local to some of the communities as we learn. So for example, in Liverpool, we're learning that certain parts of the city are not coming forward, so let's go to them. And at the same time, usually we come along with a big dose of training the trainers. And so when I visited last Monday, the military were training care home staff and carers how to administer the lateral flow test. They will take that back, go back to their homes and train. So eventually the mass requirement decreases. It may not go completely. And then you're on to the next request. So currently vaccines, starts life with planners. But eventually, I can tell you that the vaccine will end up in mass because you'll have to deploy the soldiers. So that's how we see it. And I think with Rubicon and the veterans community, we thought at first we'd need quite a lot. That has not transpired. But I'm always thinking about where's the next mass challenge and could they be a part of it. I was talking just literally before we came here with General Strickland about whether there may be a role for veterans if we chose to roll out mass testing in a huge scale that needed human people on the ground, maybe there is a role then for those people. So that's been the flow of how we've seen those things go.
Thank you.
Chair?
Did you want to cover the formal role? Can I just, on the capabilities there, what capacity have you got now for medical support?
We have so if we're talking about medical support within vaccines, so because we've always got both medical reserves who are usually working in the NHS. So it's, you just rob Peter to pay Paul if I suddenly took a whole load of consultants out of the NHS to mobilise them. But if you're specifically talking around vaccines, we've got about 1,000 combat medics who could help in that area. I can give you the exact number. I think
that's right. Potentially some medical legislative changes that may be able to give some more, but it has to be somebody who is actually a properly trained medical person as opposed to a first aid.
What numbers?
So I can give you the exact numbers. In combat medics, we have actually quite over that. We've got nearly 2,000 combat medics, 1,803 from the Army, 379 from the RAF, and 547 from the Navy.
These are combat medics not currently being used.
So were they all being, well, some of them will be used, yes. I mean,
I'm trying to work out what the number is right now that are not being used.
Well, how much are part
so,
of
so
the
from Defence Medical Services last night, they've worked out that in order to sustain our very high readiness forces and our operational delivery, the figure sits at about 1,000.
Yeah. So 1,000 spare. Yeah. Is that roughly what it is?
We've got 150 currently committed to task and 950 regular. And by further 1,050 will be at R1 at 48 hours.
The reason why I pose this question, not to go over old ground, is we talked about the Nightingales, and the answer that came back from the Health Minister was that there wasn't enough staff for her to run these Nightingale hospitals. So I'm asking, this is the biggest crisis since the Second World War. You've got capacity. It's an enduring crisis, so it's not going away anytime soon. So there is a potential to pull in retired medics as well, which has actually been done on the civilian side. I just wondered, has this been considered or thought of? Well, again, alleviating the pressure on our NHS hospitals.
So there's a constant conversation going on between Defence Medical Services and Public Health England and Department of Health and Social Care. But I think we need to be really careful about the level of people's capabilities. And so, you know, we asked very specifically that question about who could help with vaccines and actually administering a vaccine, because that has to be a certain type of person. And actually there's a training course that Department of Health and Social Care are actually instigating for those people should they be used. But a combat medic can't run a ventilator farm. And so so we are looking, and I've always said, where can we assist? But we have to be very careful that is it a porter plus for it is a phrase that we've used. So it is something that we've offered and had the conversation. But in terms of our ability to run our own medical services and deployed operations, you find actually we don't have a huge capacity of people to do that high skill ITU business, because most of them are already...
I appreciate it. All I'm just saying is the cognitive thought that perhaps needs to go in to say, go back to our Bournemouth Hospital situation. There may be some highly trained people that are required on ventilators, but actually now, today, the majority are no longer there. But they do need special COVID training for that. But alternatively, you could also use our military capabilities to assist in the non-COVID, in the general wards, to provide support there. Again, it's the military assistance to civil effect, utilised to its full. And then you then move on to the vaccines itself, which will come on into a second. But I don't know, how long is the training course to train somebody to be able to give a vaccine?
The vaccine course, it's only a couple of hours, but essentially it's to make sure that somebody who's already a qualified medical individual is doing it in the right way.
I have made clear that they are available to assist in injecting and helping people actually receive the vaccine. We actually think, going back to the mass bit, that the bigger part of our contribution will be the distribution of the vaccines. Yeah. From warehouse to NHS area.
The last time I spoke to my local authority, they hadn't been in communication with anybody from the MOD to, or from top down, to be aware of what support you could bring in the distribution, in the logistics, into the actual delivery of the vaccine as well. So again, what I'm picking up here is that there maybe is a disjoint between the offering the service that you can provide and what could be received.
Well, that would be because the vaccine task force is in charge of it, the central controlled vaccine task force. So the question for your hospital or anyone else is, have you been in touch with the vaccine task force or indeed the Department of Health or NHS England?
Right.
Because they are the ones who are going to own and deliver, well, Public Health England is going to distribute, and then from there the delivery, stroke injecting, I suspect, will be done by the NHS. We will be there in assistance.
Okay.
So the question for them is, have you spoken to either the...
Have you received a formal MACA request in relation to vaccines yet?
Yes, we've already got at the moment working in the vaccine.
Yeah, so what we've got is 8 people working in the Department of NHS England and Procurement in their ops room, to set up an ops room.
Sorry, no, this is all the back of the office stuff. I'm talking about the mass rollout in local authorities. Has there been any request from local authorities to say, I can't handle this, the scale of this is...
Well, we haven't got to that stage yet, Tobias.
Right.
So I think the important thing, I was talking to Brigadier Phil Prosser from 101 Log Brigade, who is helping assist in the planning of the end-to-end process of the vaccine rollout. And he sits in NHS England Improvement. And the important thing is, from his perspective, the first cohort that is actually going to be played through is through the NHS. And it really becomes when vaccines come online and those sorts of things. And they are content at the moment that using existing distribution mechanisms from HADOC, a third-party contractor, and the existing NHS structures, that they can do their first cohort of people who actually are NHS workers and key workers. And so where they're starting to ask us in 2 areas, one is planners, again, and the second one is a potential MACA coming in to look at 10 sites to help them set up some sites. But that's very embryonic, because the first thing they're looking at actually is using existing structures to flow out the first phase of the vaccine.
Okay, I think the point has been made. Richard Jackson and I share the same sort of county health authority. It is overwhelmed in dealing with the challenge, as can be understood. And therefore, the assets, the support that you can bring, it needs to be made clear, I think, because it would be very much welcomed if they were aware of what you could actually provide with this mass rollout that's going to be required. And I know you say it's not for now, but you need to get the thinking in place, because it is 2 to 3 months.
That thinking is being done, but I keep referring to you that the simple matter of fact is, if the Department of Health isn't feeling that pressure from its local hospitals, that is a question for NHS England and the local Department of Health. They should be feeding it up, saying our beds are full, or we can't do this, or we can't do that, and we will help. We will absolutely help. But if that either the message isn't getting to the brain from in the brain of the whole task force, then there is something. As the local MP, as everything else, you can do something about and help that. It is not on our part that they don't know about it, or that they haven't had the assistance. The assistance is there if they want it, and that's why we are in those all bodies right now, trying to make sure that we plan how to help it. But if for example, I don't know the ins and outs of the vaccine rollout because it hasn't been decided. But let's say they use a network of all the Boots pharmacies and all the Lloyd's pharmacies and all the local pharmacies and all the GP surgeries and all the local hospitals trusts. The point General Strickland makes is, the most efficient way, first and foremost, is using existing structures if they have the capacity to do it. I mean, because you don't reinvent the wheel. If it's there, it's there. So if you think about it, when we were looking at examples of how to get lateral flow to more people, which person visits your house every single day? Nearly every, or 6 days a week? Whether you live down a track up a hill or whether you live in the centre of a city? The postie.
Okay.
And so there are lots of questions about how we piggyback existing.
Understand that we're on your side. We want actually to get the best out of the armed forces, because we believe it is a fantastic asset. One of the things that we can be very, very proud of. You talk about the brain, though, in understanding all the moving parts. We assumed that perhaps you would be part of that brain in the number 10 to be able to sort of coordinate all this together. The point has been made. I think Emma has now rejoined us. If Emma is there, I can't see her yet. If not, I'll start the question off and then maybe she can join in. The questions is to do with winter is obviously a challenging period, not just for the NHS, but for local authorities and other matters. You've had to step in to deal with flooding and snow conditions and so forth. How is your preparations, your normal setup, Operation Tempora and otherwise? Are you able to continue your support for the pandemic and be prepared for any other additional requests that you may receive?
Yes, so we thought about this some months ago, probably in early autumn, about the potential of a perfect storm where flu, NHS pressures, COVID and floods and everything else and Brexit all come together. we set up even then, again, learning the lessons in SJC, we've moved to a more overall sort of force that is able to do a number of these tasks. John Stickland can give you a sort of overview of it. We keep topping it up if we think there's going to be more. Literally in the last 24 hours, we've gone from 12,500 to over 14,000 in anticipation of any pressures. If you remember at the very first start of at the very beginning of this process, we were quite crude and we took 20,000 and we put aside. We ended up actually only using on any one day about 4,000 people, so we've refined that, but we're starting to step up again.
So I think it's interesting, the Honourable Member's point about learning lessons. In the construct of this force, we absolutely looked at that agricultural 20,000 we threw at the problem in February and March and have now refined it right down. So in the answer to the Honourable Member's question about resilience and sort of normal floods and fires, we still hold two UK standby battalions, which amounts to about 1,200 people at 12 and 24 hours notice to move. So those are the ones that we would use routinely should there be a dam burst, a flood, and those sorts of things. So they remain part of the winter operations package. As the Secretary of State said, we're also focusing on holding various other forces at readiness for standard resilience activities. So armed police backbill under tempora is not part of something to do with COVID. It's still been ring-fenced for the delivery of that outcome. And then similarly, we have a thing called Escalin, which is tanker drivers. Similarly, should that be something that comes under the Brexity side of things, we have ring-fenced individuals to play that through. And then on top of that, we've essentially, as the Secretary of State said, layered what we found were the most useful bits of defence for the COVID response. And interestingly, we found we sort of categorised them as mass, bodies that do stuff, command and control, logisticians and engineers, and medics, and we manage them in specific pots. And again, as the Secretary says, if we've used some, we try and top them up. Yeah. And the main thing that we've been trying to do in the creation of this force, though, that I think is important, is to maintain core operational output, whether that is very high readiness forces to go and intervene somewhere, or the things that we're doing overseas all the time and the support that's required, but also, where possible, to make sure we understand the resilience of defence into 21 and 22. So core programmes, our recruiting, our training pipeline, which stopped in March and February, actually that's the thing we've absolutely sought to maintain. So we've tried to make sure we've got a sensible balance in our provision and depthfully learnt from what we did with the 20,000 into a more coherent force.
Right. Thank you for that. Richard.
General, can I just quickly pick up on that point? I think when we first started, the 20,000 figure that you had, if I recall from those who I know serving, they were put to one side, almost bubbled, if that's the right phrase, and told to stay at home, in effect, until they were called upon, or if they were called on. Is that happening now to your two standby battalions? Are they now, in effect, at home and not operational and waiting to be called? Or are they training, doing all the things that battalions normally do?
So again, I think we reflect on, everybody shut down, didn't they, in February, March, April of last year. So there was a, crikey, how do we handle this as an organisation? And as you say, a lot of people were sent home and bubbled. What we've tried to do with this force now, in the main, is keep people at readiness, but doing their day jobs, rather than having people particularly ring-fenced. And that's really actually been the most productive thing. So our ability to actually have somebody, at 5 days' notice to move, that still allows them to get on with their training, to run their establishment, and potentially to be an individual augmentee planner, but their boss knows they're on a tether that actually, should the call go up, I'll lose that individual to go and be a planner. So again, a learning process. So I think we're much more efficient by using notice to move than bubbling.
Do they have different R levels? Even within a single battalion, you'll have R1 at 24 hours notice to move, R2 at R1 plus at 48 hours notice to move, R2 at 5 days, and R3 at 10 days. So that so it might be done by company, so one country will be on 24 hours, the other one might be on 10 days notice, so they can get on and do their normal training, whatever planning, and they will rotate through. So both they get some relief within their own unit, but also that they are ready to move. But of course, just like your day, you'll notice that you'll remember that notice to move never seem to be notice to move. I remember often, 5 days notice to move, and about a day later you're told to go. And so no move before, I think, is a much better way of doing things.
I'm guilty of that with a couple of very quick ones that have come in, which is, I'm really, really sorry. I know you were at 5 days, but I need you to be there in 2 days' time, please. And bless the boys and girls, they normally are.
Brexit was mentioned. What can you just give us a flavour as to what you're anticipating, what you've been asked to prepare for?
Well, some of it comes out of Yellowhammer and all the previous ones. So it is making sure that the UK is resilient on logistics chains. That would be making sure that the UK gets access to supplies, whatever it needs, whether that's medicine or even other things, just normal commodities. Also areas around fisheries and protecting our ports, etc. We've got to make sure that if on Brexit. The worst case scenario, migrant flows, protests, blockades, all those sort of things, to make sure that we know how we can deal with that in that space. And then, of course, also being prepared and being flexible to help out everything from, discussions around, if you remember, there was always the plans about backing up on the Kent, I can't remember its name, but, use of military bases to park lorries and all that.
Operation
sort of
Stack, I think.
Stack, exactly. So that sort of thing. The plus side is before COVID, the work we've done on things like Yellowhammer, has been brought forward, and the other thing is suddenly all the other government departments are in a much more alert mind state than they might have been because of COVID. So I think that's the first thing to say. But it's quite broad. And some of them are interchangeable, but it certainly brings into play things like maritime security much more than the past, and that's been very useful. Anything to add, Joss?
Not really, Secretary State. I think that's
okay.
covers it.
Good. If we can, sorry, yes, please do it.
Just quickly coming on that, it's brilliant that they got R1 to R3, notice to move. And you said that the Army's brilliant with its resilience, and what we're effectively doing here is plugging gaps and making sure that the country is resilient. There's got to be a point where you no longer have resilience. X amount of troops here, X amount of troops there, and the current commitments that we've got. There's got to be a point where how many people can we let go to Maketas before it actually breaks our resilience?
Well, I think that's why you're absolutely right. And it's not infinite resource. That's also why it's in our interest to help departments refine their ask as well. It is in our interest to make sure that we just don't, jump in with both feet when someone says, I need 9,000 people, and actually you work out what you really need to do. So that is true. It's also true that I think if we were doing this for years on end, it would have a cost. It would have a cost not only on our defence tasks, it would have a cost on people and personnel who join first and foremost to be a helicopter pilot or a logistical specialist in the military. So, of course, that is important, and that's why rotating through people, but just like other military deployments, where if you think about it, we've always had training up for something on your op, and then coming off the ops and another block, the third. It is a similar task as well to make sure that other people, when they finish this rescript and other stuff, that they are back into the pipeline. But long-term deployment like this would in the end have an effect. We're not there yet. We're managing our defence tasks. We have been fortunate about some of our adversaries. They too have suffered COVID, so their ability to provoke or disrupt in some parts of the world has been minimalised. Even COVID, ISIS started issuing guidance to its volunteers about COVID, which I thought was rather amusing. Well, sad actually, but nevertheless, So I think we've reaped some benefit from other people being less active as well.
Thank you for that, Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, we know that the MOD, the Armed Forces personnel, made a major difference in terms of PPE. Could I ask you a question in two parts? Were you asked at any point to take on and run the test and trace system, which, as you know, has been major concerns and problems with? And if you were, why didn't that happen? And if you were not asked, do you believe that actually it could have been run better by a senior military officer than involving lots of consultants?
So I think it would be misleading to just say, look, well, first of all, I think probably I would say this, but I think the military can run an awful lot, quite an awful lot, pretty straightforward. I think anyone who's worked in the MOD, as you have, Stephen, knows that the can-do attitude and the determination just to live with risk in a way that other people wouldn't is absolutely one of our greatest strengths. And no matter what political party you come from, working in the MOD never leaves you learning that about the people that we work with. I think, but what I would say is let's again remember that when the testing stuff started, they were complicated pieces of equipment. They're not as easy as they are now with lateral flow tests. I went up to Liverpool to see the current easy test that is now an easy test. So it was a little more complex. Also, the question of what we were trying to achieve with the test. I mean, testing is one thing, if you know you're ill or not ill, but if you couldn't do it at scale, and the other challenge was doing it at scale. So do I think that we can do more? Yes, and we are doing more. We are right now planning and assisting how we can do more on mass testing and tracing. And actually, with the new testing equipment, the lateral flow, where you can get your results definitely within under an hour, it can be even 20 minutes, and they are pretty easy to self-administer, actually the question doesn't become so much about tracing as about testing. You know, I mean, if the ultimate goal is to get to the stage where you wake up in the morning, you take a test, and if you're ill, you stay at home, and if you're not, you don't, then I think that changes the balance. But look, we are right now helping, planning, rolling out mass testing.
Could I, and you're right, I understand the can-do attitude and ability because I spent time in the MOD, as you know. But can I come back to the question I asked you? Were you asked at any point to take on the test and trace system? Not just one part of it, but the test and trace system. So can we just start from that
I wasn't asked to take over the test and trace system in its entirety.
So you were never asked to run the test and trace system?
Not in its entirety at all. We have been asked throughout about improving it or helping it or assisting it or delivering some of it, but never, you know, could you send a general and run it?
Do you believe you could have run it?
Let me see. I think what we didn't have was the knowledge of the science that would enable us to run testing in a way that was any different from how it was rolled out at the moment. And I'll give an example. Actually, we brought our knowledge to bear en masse without having to run it. Mobile testing units was designed by the armed forces, delivered by the armed forces, rolled out by the armed forces, and then eventually handed over. And that
Secretary of State, sorry to interrupt, but I do want to just press this, and I understand what you're saying. But I am talking, the question I'm asking about is whether the MOD, the Armed Forces personnel, could have run the system. There would, of course, be medical expertise involved in that and advising, like there are with consultants who are being brought in. So I just wonder, do you believe that the MOD and Armed Forces personnel could have run the system with the necessary support?
Well, you have to, the other part is, could I have run it better? Well, we could have run the system. Could we have run it better? I think we'll know that when it comes to an inquiry and the wash-up of this whole event. But of course we could have run something. You know, we could run lots of things, but whether we could run it better is a decision that is a judgment we can only make in retrospect when this is all over.
But you weren't asked. Did you offer to run it?
We offered to run everything.
Did you offer to run the?
We offered to run. I have offered over these last 8 months, Stephen, to run an awful lot of things.
This has suddenly got very, very interesting indeed, because this, I think, is what we're trying to sort of tease out, is the fact that we have this fantastic asset, and we join with you in praising what our armed forces can do, but they've not been utilised to their full capacity. And the test and trace system is a great example of one of many. It's a bit like the number 10 playing golf, having the woods in their golf bag, but never utilising them because they don't understand them. And that's, I'm afraid, the analogy that seems to be developing here. Sorry, Derek, I cut you off. Do you want to complete? Because I think Martin also wants to come in on this point.
Yeah. So I do note your sort of gentleman. By the way, it's Derek, not Stephen.
Sorry.
Can I just again? Did you actually offer to run the test and trace system?
Well, as I said at the beginning of this, there hasn't been a cabinet when I haven't offered to the cabinet that we are here to help. There hasn't been a week or a fortnight where I haven't been in touch with the health secretary or others, offering to provide assistance. My colleagues and senior officials all know that we are here to help, and we will help. It is a subjective view about whether we could have done it better, and I think only time will tell, and retrospective inquiry will tell about whether somebody else could have done something better. And I think that is the key. But let's remember, we are dwarfed by the scale of the NHS and the million-plus workers in the NHS. So the sense that there wasn't other people out there perfectly capable of helping is wrong. There are, and also what I would say.
But it costs a lot of money to pay consultants.
Look, I'm not going to, it's not those decisions, contracting decisions.
I think I'll go on to another question. Can we just refer to the mass testing programme in Liverpool?
Yeah. It's cut off. You've gone to mute.
You muted yourself, I think.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, can you just confirm for the record in terms of the testing in Liverpool that there were actually 2,000 Armed Forces personnel there. Is that correct?
Yes, they've gone, I think they're above 2,000, over 2,000.
Okay, and we're very grateful, and I know people up there are very grateful for the work that our Armed Forces personnel have done there. What about your ability to cope with a programme that's expanded to London or even possibly, all the major cities?
Well, I think that's what, when I was asked earlier, I'm just trying to look to get you the exact testing in Liverpool. So at the moment in Liverpool, we are delivering, in the last 24 hours, 11,130 tests, but our testing capacity is about 38,000. So that's the current gap. And, look, I'm a Lancashire MP, and the greatest thing is I work very well with Joe Anderson. I live up in the northwest, and it was great to see that when local government, national government, the armed forces and volunteers worked together, we delivered a really good package, and we still stand by to do even more in Liverpool if they need it. Because for me, and you, I can't wait to help Liverpool out of lockdown. We want to get the economy going and people back. So that's been good. Look, the simple limit on our ambitions and our capability is the size of the armed forces. I mean, could I do a Liverpool rollout tomorrow across the whole of the UK? No, I don't have that many people to cover that population. So it's why it's really important to import lessons learned to make sure to find out how we can replicate what we've learned in Liverpool, but at a scale that may be required of us. And I mentioned earlier about things like POST, things like using local volunteers, things like Rubicon, using veterans and other volunteers to help. But the answer is no, we couldn't do it en masse at that scale because of the size of our armed forces.
Thank you.
And finally, Chair, just the vaccines, you're being helped to prepare for the vaccine programme?
Yes, we are. We have currently, I can tell you how many are working in the vaccine place. It's 7 MACAs are open at the moment for vaccines. We have 59, it was 8, sorry, we have 59 persons working in the vaccine task force, which will obviously convert into the action, which into many, many more. And I don't know the exact figure of how much we think in the first draft. But
to be honest, Secretary of State, we're still doing the force sensing and understanding the manpower delta. So it's at that level of maturity that we're working with the structure and the rollout, and really making sure that, as I said before, much of the distribution is done by third-party contractors and much of the distribution is done by existing systems. So we're trying to work out what that manpower delta is where we need to help, and that's ongoing work.
Thank you, Secretary of State. Chair, over to you.
Derek, thank you for that. Okay. To Martin, I think Sarah's indicating as well, but to Martin first of all.
Thank you, Chair. I've got to say, though, that some of this conversation and the way it's going, I think as though we're trying to create jobs, total jobs for the armed forces. They'll be bringing back the Green Goddess and being asked to empty the bins next. And I think that's not where we want to go. We want the armed forces to be doing the right job at the right time, led by the right people. And my concern, if we turn this question upside down, is shouldn't this be seen as a public health matter and be led by public health professionals? Because if we look at the gold standard on terms of test and trace, is Germany, and neither private consultants nor the armed forces are involved, because these are the best people to be leading it, are public health professionals. Now, I'm not saying, Chair, that the armed forces and military should not be involved in the rollout, etc., but it must be led from the top by public health professionals getting over the public health message. I think because Derek, I think, is trying to make the point that allowing it to be led by private consultants, and where we're seeing vast wastes of money in terms of test and trace in some parts of the UK. I'm not saying it's perfect in every part of it, but I know that in Scotland, it's been led by NHS Scotland and not by private consultants. Should we really be making sure that it's public health professionals that are leading on test and trace?
Well, what I can say is, in the following on from Derek's point about mass testing, the model we are exploring is letting the public health leads shape how they want to achieve mass testing. So it is, and funnily enough, in Liverpool, exactly, the other person I missed out when I said we've enjoyed working very closely with has been the Public Health Director, Mr. Ashworth, who is excellent individual, who is working alongside Joe Anderson and our Brigadier, Joe Fossey, to absolutely shape that response. And I think there's definitely an issue about, public health directors. One of the lessons we learned from Salisbury is public health directors are very, very important, both locally and nationally, at dealing with this type of thing.
Thank you, Chair. I'll leave it there.
Martin, thank you. Sarah, did you want to come in on this one?
Yes, just very, very quickly, please, Chair. Whilst we're on the subject of vaccines, have some defence personnel going to be given priority to the vaccine? I'm thinking about submarine crew.
Do you want to take this? So we've just started to do our prioritisation as how it would play out. But interestingly, in terms of the priorities government has set, we sit very, very low down, because actually this should be about getting doctors and the most vulnerable, because of the way that the vaccines work. Essentially, in many respects, they're not stopping you getting it, they're stopping the symptoms actually killing you. And so if you are vulnerable, so it's making sure that those cohorts of health workers and the most vulnerable come as a highest priority. So we at the moment will obviously put in our requests for where we think defence should have had vaccinations, but at the moment we're also being very honest that we are genuinely a relatively young, fit and vibrant group of people that can manage it in a different way. So that's the first point. We will be low down the priority, rightly so, in terms of in relation to the vulnerable and other key workers. The second point, though, is what we're doing internal to defence is doing our own pilots in terms of how we can use the lateral flow testing, both one to survey our populations. So, for example, a training establishment, if we can test everybody at the gate, we can weed people out, they can go and isolate, and we can let the cohort get on with training. But also we're at the forefront of the conversation about test to release. And that might be somebody who has had a contact or somebody who has come through a travel corridor. If you test them in a different way, you can actually get them back into the workplace quickly. So, and we're working with Public Health England to work out how to do that. And those pilots to use asymptomatic testing to support our one survey population of 2 back in the game start on the 8th of December. And we feel that's probably more important for the defence at this stage, while others are taking the vaccine to start with.
Thank you, General. Thanks. Thanks, Chair.
Further to Sarah's question, can I just probe this a bit further? And have you had any outbreaks on board any of the ships, or indeed, let's say, Sandhurst? What scale have you been affected by the pandemic?
I can give you the figures. We have had outbreaks. Interestingly enough, some of our sort of defence expertise has been very good at dealing with how to deal with it. We had an outbreak on a ship. We had and they were isolated and dealt with it properly. I'm just going to get you the exact number for help.
Which
number of MED tested? If you like, I can give you the figures. So there have been 44,197 service personnel tested. The number of positive tests have been 1,197, 392 in the Navy, Army 611 and RAF 194, and apart from only 85, all the rest have been in the UK. So we have had them. They have been dealt with in accordance with the advice, and they have been isolated. In some cases, we would do quarantine before going on a deployment, tested throughout, and if anything happened, either taken off a ship if they could be, or if not, they were isolated, and that slowed the spread or stopped the spread in many cases.
So on the ship, which ship was it that was affected?
The Queen Elizabeth vessel.
Queen Elizabeth,
HMS Richmond also. But because I think, as the Secretary of State's articulated, we've taken outbreak management very seriously.
Yeah.
And we've used some of the technology in our biomedical technicians, actually to put them on deploying ships, and they have a test capability. So we've done very simply is on the carrier, we've had areas where we've said actually we're going to have an isolation facility.
Okay, so just walk me through what on the carrier itself. The carrier departed. I presume it was moving into an operational environment or on exercise, and
yes.
I don't know what the crew is now. Is it 500 or something like that?
It's circa 850. Depends on what you've got loaded.
Depends on what you absolutely. You had an outbreak. How many people were affected on it?
I can't give you the exact figures, so I can come back to you, but essentially it was managed as an outbreak. So we had two basic plans. One is if it is an individual who has not been in contact with others, because we always said that she was within helicopter reach of the land, that individual would be CASEVAC'd and isolated off. But actually, again, we've got a protocol on all naval vessels for how you have an isolation facility. And you work out, you essentially do a contact trace on board, and then you isolate those people on board. And that's
but I presume you're doing testing before you actually depart.
Yes. So low figures. So if my memory serves me right, and I'll write to correct if it isn't, on the first deployment, Queen Elizabeth, there were 4 people, and they were taken off. On the second deployment, we're talking low double figures. It wasn't like another scenario we've seen on other aircraft carriers or anything else. It was very controlled. And then, funnily enough, we've also learned, because we have quite a controlled population, we've actually been able to feed in learning from these outbreaks. So, classic example of soldiers' innovation. When we moved up 2,000 people to Liverpool, in Pontins, you can map, the people in there, what's happened, and if there'd been an outbreak, how they got it, and then what we did with those people, and then the tracing around those people, the circulation of how they moved, and then they would be removed from, let's say, their room and put in an isolation block. So we've learned quite a lot also about the disease from that as well. And it's all about personal skills, personal discipline. It's meant that we have a better chance than most. Routine in defence, if you remember that sort of stuff. But it is absolutely making the difference. And so we're not immune to it like anyone else, but and interesting enough, in some of those environments, you see people who just don't get it. Everyone else seems to either be asymptomatic or indeed have it, but there were 1 or 2 people who just didn't have it at all, and I think all that lesson is fed into the system.
I'd raise one other one the Secretary of State mentioned, which is probably worth highlighting to the committee, is what we've called the QFAC, the quarantine facility. To deploy people overseas, particularly into operations in Afghanistan or Iraq, but also depending on at sea, which has been done by the Navy, we've looked very carefully at having a 14-day isolation facility where part of their pre-deployment process is to go to either Shrivenham, or we've also got some sites that the single services hold. And then there is testing that happens, asymptomatic testing happens normally about 3 times through that process. And that means that when they've deployed to Afghanistan or deployed to Iraq as examples, the receiving coalition organisation is pretty comfortable that the UK team are in a good medical state, but also we can assure that we know we're looking after our people in that sense. So that's been a process that we've had in train since about June this year, and we will continue to roll it through. So I hope that again gives you a picture of how seriously we're taking it.
Thank you for that. The footprint that you have across the world in upstream engagement, you mentioned Afghanistan, Iraq, we had training programs taking place there as well, is very impressive indeed, and I think is not perhaps highlighted enough as to what we do across the world. But a lot of that effort had to be withdrawn at the start of this pandemic, or around February, March time. Are you able to say, have we been able to return in many of those cases? How have we adapted?
Yeah. So the Chief Joint Operations Admiral Ben Key looked very carefully with us, as you say, in terms of where the medical pathways were or medical facilities in the areas where we were operating weren't appropriate. So, as you say, we brought numbers back. And essentially all we've done is just monitor how coalition colleagues and the structures in which we operate have reacted to COVID, have become COVID safe and operated intelligently.
The question wasn't so much on the mechanics of the individuals, it was what is our footprint now? Have we got back to where we were before with what we were doing?
I would say, apart from very small numbers in Iraq, because some of it has been moved into Kuwait, the footprint has been re-established.
Okay.
Looking at Somalia, looking at training teams in Africa, our force flowing into Mali. So we have recalibrated and gone back to the footprint we had.
And just while we're on force numbers, Afghanistan, what are our numbers there currently?
I'll have to answer that too. I don't know.
I think it's in the region of about 400 based around Kabul.
Yeah, I think it's 3 something, mainly Kabul.
What, slightly away from what we're talking about here now, but obviously President Trump's decision to remove US troops, could you just qualify what's happening to our
Well, I think we would take the position that in line with the Secretary General of NATO's statement on that, which is it is a NATO deployment. We go in together, we leave together. That we are minded that our job is to provide stability and security to the Afghan people, and that force levels dropping below a certain level would be problematic for us all. I have engaged with my US counterpart last week to discuss that issue, and we haven't seen the detail of the reduction, exactly how that's going to be achieved, but we are making it very clear alongside our other NATO partners that it is very, very important that we do so in a way that doesn't leave the Afghans vulnerable and our NATO partners vulnerable should that happen. And we are still continuing to plan and train for the forces going back to do the Kabul. We've already got a unit, a regiment, I think, out there at the moment, and that will be replaced by another one. That's not changing at the moment. We need a sufficient force structure to be able to do our counter-terrorism and our protection.
So will you revisit your entire footprint come the 20th of January after the inauguration of the next president?
Well, if the United States continues to draw down, one of the challenges for NATO, one of the challenges for the integrated review is, at the moment, our dependency is so great that if the United States were to unilaterally completely pull out of Afghanistan, it would give very little options for the other nations. So
I'm afraid it's a pretty petty and irresponsible decision by the Commander-in-Chief of the US forces, is it not? We'll move on to the next question. Stuart, do you want to take us forward on the money side?
Last week's announcement was outstanding, and one of the reviews we're doing, seeing a multi-year funding, if we didn't get that, that was a huge problem. So thank you for the work you did on that. But this year's taken a huge impact of resources. What's the cost of
the marginal cost is 27.7 million at the moment.
Sorry, say again?
27.7 million pounds at the moment is the marginal cost of the MACAs that we have delivered. It's not the end of the financial year, but that is the marginal cost for our assistance.
Okay, and as it's a MACA task, surely it shouldn't come out of the MOD budget.
No, so those costs will be met by the departments.
And you're confident that you'll get those costs recovered?
Well, send the debt collectors in if they don't. But yeah, I mean, that is the agreement that they have with the Cabinet Office and us. But look, there is no indication, let me be absolutely clear, that they are not going to pay for the costs. I mean, it is without doubt, part of the process. It's marginal, it's not full recovery. So it is, and you could argue that £27 million is not a massive lot compared to the other sums of money that the departments are spending.
What do you estimate that to be at the end of the current financial year?
Well, I can't give you an estimation. I suspect it will go up simply because my point about going to mass, that if the military are involved in more vaccine rollout, the mass starts to pick up, and the more people cost more money. But I think people will be surprised how low it is in numbers. It's not. I was surprised to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Secretary of State, do you mind if I take you back almost to where we started this session with integrated review and fleet solid support ships to ask two specific questions. What impact has this pandemic had on major procurement programs and on armed forces recruitment?
Well, on the major programs, the defence manufacturers have actually done an amazing job. They have lost very few days. I think the plus side is they already had quite big spaces. If you're operating, I went to visit David Brown Gearboxes in Huddersfield last Friday. These big engineering firms have a large scale space so they can operate, and often if they're operating machinery anyhow, they're doing it away from each other. So they have done a fantastic job at maintaining the flow of both defence manufacturing and products. So we haven't seen a major delay to any programme caused by COVID. That's a plus side. And I think, like all our constituents who will be worried about the economic impact, for some of our constituents it's a very welcome opportunity to be working and engaging. There's been no shortage of people wanting to go to work and to contribute to building great things for this country. And the big defence companies have already been quite used to allowing people to work on secure IT at home. So, these sort of things have been in a good place. So I think in that sense, it's been positive. On recruitment, there was early on a pause in the depot's functioning and how they did it. I'm going to investigate the grenade throwing scandal when I go up on Thursday. And the left. You can do a right form as well, so I'm interested to know why I can't do a left form.
Well, I'd be intrigued to know. It's dangerous about the left form.
But we have quite rightly gone back to picking up and living with COVID effectively in the training of our forces. I was privileged enough to take on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen the Sovereign's Parade in August, and some of those men and women passing out had literally been in sort of quarantine, for their last term at Sandhurst, where they hadn't been able to go out or anything else other than just focus on their courses. So we've, as ever in the military, adapted, improvised and overcome. But if there's anything else, John,
from a statistic perspective, 1920, we've hit 93% of the target, which was this surge afterwards, which is 31% up on 18-19. And some of that is us adapting and developing with COVID, but I think also there's some very clear socioeconomic issues in terms of, an opportunity for an employer and also people being retained. So the statistics play that actually people have done a really good job to do virtual recruiting and all of the very adaptive things that people have to do after an initial pause in April.
Is it fair to say, Secretary of State, then, that in a year's time or 18 months' time, when we ask you about the delay in any procurement and you cite coronavirus as the reason for the delay, we'll be able to play back this clip from Hansard?
Well, you'll be able to play back that I said no major delay, major being the word. Of course, it will have had...
Do you wish to categorise then the latest?
I shall leave that for when you challenge me in a year's time. But no, look, I think of course everything has slowed down in some areas, but very quickly picked back up again.
Okay.
And
more
comparable.
More tangibly then, how have you ensured that the defence industrial supply chain has been supported during this pandemic? If you'll remember, I asked you a number of months ago about the opportunities to either pump prime or bring forward aspects that would give confidence and an injection of funds into the supply chain. Have you taken any of those steps?
Yes, well, we brought forward some of the long lead items on Type 26, where we could effectively get money out of the door to stimulate the economy. If you remember early on, we tried to bring forward things like the Type 26 long lead times, bringing forward other production schedules where that was possible, or laying orders. We brought forward some defence infrastructure plans. I went with the Chancellor to Catterick to talk about some of the improvements there to that infrastructure. So we have definitely brought some projects forward where it has been possible to do so, for the double purpose, both the social economic purpose, but also for the purpose of getting on with trying to bring forward capabilities that we need.
Are you in a position to conceptualise that, to indicate the value of the programmes that were brought forward?
I can send you the best thing is for me to send to the committee either the examples and the cost that those examples were, the funding that we brought forward, and indeed how that impacts on the programmes. But the major delays that I see before me at the moment are not because of COVID.
Thank you.
Gavin, thank you. The committee had a wonderful visit down to, I think, Corsham, was it? Where we visited and saw some of the land warfare vehicles. 4 all were in the pipeline, if I can put it that way. Challenger 3 upgrade, Warrior upgrade, Boxer, and the Ajax. Lulworth. I read today that Boxer has moved a notch forward. Certainly that was mooted in the press. Are you able to give an update on what's happening with these 4 projects?
Yeah, I can give you a very top-line budget. So I have encouraged Boxer to be brought forward. In this IR, one of the things is we need to sunset, as we say, as the Chief Defence Staff would say, some capabilities that really are either running out of their capabilities, and we need to sunrise some new capabilities. The only big challenge is how long is the night between the two, and that's why this funding settlement was so really important, to give us that funding headroom to do that. And so Boxer is really a key part of the future, and getting it as forward as possible is really useful. It's also useful for export opportunities as well, because the great thing about our Boxer deal that we did was if we can help land export contracts abroad, a number of them will be made in the UK, which I think is good for jobs in Telford and Stockport, where a large part of it, and many of the components are British. In the area currently of Ajax, there is a slight pause in the area around the turret. So we're just trying to sort out some issues with the turret, so that has caused a delay. I'm not sure how material the impact is on that, on its delivery time, but I think it's not a massive material impact of that. Issues around Warrior upgrade and Challenger, I think we'll lay out the details in the going forward on plans we have to discuss modernisation, and going back to this point about what are we going to do with all our money is basically the question that we need to answer, you, Parliament, stakeholders and our allies, and we'll lay that out in the future.
That's very, very helpful. Finally, we're just drawing to a close. Can I just step back from all of this and just look at our relationship with the United States, which I know you've worked hard and continue to work hard on as our closest security ally. President-elect Biden has announced a formidable foreign policy team, and will probably move us into, I believe, a new era of Western leadership. And yet here we are about to mark the start of our own G presidency by potentially cutting the overseas aid budget. There is a interesting relationship between hard power and soft power, which the MOD appreciates possibly more than most. would you not agree that downgrading our soft power programs potentially could leave vacuums in some of the poorest parts of the world that will cause further poverty and instability, and therefore more a requirement that hard power might be required, and those vacuums could easily be filled by Russia and China? This doesn't give the picture of us claiming genuinely to be a global Britain when we should really be advancing a sense of duty as the West gains greater resolve with new leadership in the White House.
Well, Chairman, I don't know what is in the Chancellor's budget, so I don't know whether...
Tell me.
I don't... Tobias, you have been in government. Chancellors keep their budgets very close to their chest. Yes, I'm telling you. So I don't know, and it would be wrong to speculate. But what I could just point out, and you know this, that soft power doesn't belong in other departments anymore. It belongs in our department as well. And if anything, the lessons of constant competition is, which you allude to China and Russia, is that soft power is much part of defence's output as anybody else's. I know an awful lot of soldiers who are also humanitarian aid workers. I don't know many humanitarian aid workers who are also soldiers. Our soldiers right now are delivering peacekeeping, engineering and capability development in some of the poorest parts of Africa. Our soldiers help secure countries so food programs can actually go ahead. There's no point delivering a food program into a country that is in anarchy or chaos, or where the food gets siphoned off onto the black market and never gets to the people. So, our survey ship was one of the first into Beirut. Our Navy divers were on hand to help them should they wish it. Our RAF flew PPE out to Mali in the height of this COVID problem. We have, over 300 personnel deploying right now to Mali to help in that most poor country's stability and security. We had a team of Royal Engineers in Sudan, one of the other most poor countries in Africa. Humanitarian aid, soft power, is part of our job. And so it is not mutually exclusive. Or let me put it another way, the former DFID did not have the monopoly on humanitarian aid and Britain's soft power. HMS RFA Argos and HMS Medway have been right now helping in Honduras on hurricane relief, have been in the Caribbean on COVID and economic support. And they're grey ships with white ensigns if you're HMS Medway. And I think that's my point on humanitarian aid.
So there is time between now and the Chancellor's statement tomorrow for him to be made aware of everything you just told us. Because if the taxpayer was aware that this could be paid for out of ODA funding, which much of it, I'm afraid, cannot be because of out-of-date rules, there would be greater support to support the continuation of 0.7% spend. You make a very powerful point that the blurring of war fighting to peacekeeping, the military do an incredible job. Even sending our ships to support the Royal Marines going to support the Caribbean after a hurricane, we can't claim on that. The rules need updating, and were that to happen, then our soft power capabilities on us giving the perception that we're stepping back from global Britain would not be threatened. So I do hope that's something that is a conversation that might be you would share with the Chancellor. We've covered a wide variety of subjects, not least the pandemic. I'm afraid, Anthony McGee, you've got off scot-free completely today. I don't even know what accent you've got, let alone your contribution, but I'm sure we'll get you another time to speak. Secretary of State, Major General Charles Stickland, Anthony McGee, thank you very much indeed for joining this committee this afternoon. Thank you to committee members as well. This brings to a close this committee session